It wants me to add a title ahead, but I think.
Oh, okay. Oh, we're streaming. I got the live.
Oh, are we live? We did it. I'm
Apparently.
so proud of us.
We're live. I know. Let me see if I can share it now.
So for those of you who don't know us, we are Team Eris Conflict Resolution. I'm Meredith Holly. I'm a lawyer and power dynamics facilitator and bestselling author, and we help employees stop sexual harassment without quitting their jobs. Erin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I do. I'm Erin. I am the client success manager for Eris, and love getting to chat with Meredith every Monday about what's going on in the news.
Yeah, so we really, a lot of people reach out to me and kind of say, did you hear about this thing? Did you hear about that thing in the news? And kind of like, I feel like there's this tension of we want to stay engaged in current events. We want to stay participating in the world around us. And then sometimes it's like so overwhelming to see every week all of the abuses of power that go on, everything that is kind of just not where we want to go in culture, right? And how do you stay connected versus how do you stay healthy? And so that's sort of what I want our focus to be when we do these news roundups. And then Erin is going to update us on the news for the week in particular areas. And we'll talk about like, how do you stay healthy, but how do you still know what's going on?
Cool. I'm excited. And I love this because when you first tasked me with this, I was like, oh my gosh, I on purpose like checked out of all the news because I like couldn't handle it anymore. So getting the multiple like alerts now on a daily basis, I do have that a little bit like of like panic and feel overwhelmed. But then when I like kind of write it out, I know that you're going to like tell me all the good things that like make it possible to like deal with this in a way that is like healthy and productive and like still allows you to be aware, but in like a powerful place, not a like, oh my gosh, I can't believe all this stuff is like
right
going on kind of place. So
I think it's easy to sort of hermit when you don't want the news to be what it is.
Right? Totally.
But you tend to stay up to date anyway, so I feel like it's a good way to make it that super productive. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. I feel really good about this. In fact, like last week I was kind of nervous to do it, but it was so fun. I feel like we had such a fun conversation and we had some good like interaction and like it felt very like empowering walking away from it instead of like, oh my gosh, I can't believe like all this crazy stuff. So,
right. Because I always sort of take the stance of like, if the news isn't what we want to hear, then we need to be more proactive in creating what we want. And like, it's a chance to make our voices louder, not a chance to peace out.
Totally. I love it. And I feel like this year in particular is a great time to like hone that skill. It feels like it's going to be a big one for news. So
far
should be good. Yeah. Yes. Well, should we dive in today with kind of our topics of like what we want to talk about?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
You tell me.
Yeah. So we have a couple of stories that I thought would be interesting to talk about today. And they all kind of have the overarching theme of like dealing with sort of an abuse of power. And so the first one that we definitely need to talk about happened just a couple hours away from us, actually, in the Portland area. And it's concerning Michael Fesser and A&B Towing and the Westland Police Department. I'm not sure if everybody like has heard about this, but
yeah, so tell us about it because I didn't know about it until you brought it up.
Yeah. So basically the Westland police chief had his officers basically working as his own personal posse to kind of initiate unwarranted and racially motivated surveillance and then the arrest of a Black Portland man because he was fishing buddies with the guy's boss. And
so that he was the man who was arrested worked at a towing company and he had made a discrimination complaint against the towing company, right? And so then there was like
Yeah, absolutely. He was basically
owner.
being, from what I understand, he was basically being harassed at work in a like racially like non-acceptable way. And
Yeah.
so he turned in, you know, a complaint to Bully that was later dismissed, but it very clearly, like with the history they gave, was like not an okay like work environment or a good
Well,
work
and
environment.
Bully's the Bureau of Labor and Industries, and they're the first place that every employment claim goes in Oregon. And the new statistics from this last year are that they dismiss 98% of claims. So they
Right.
have
I
a
knew
2%. You know, I'm like, this like makes me like totally crazy. And I know that they're trying to make some improvements over there, but that is an outrageous statistic. There was one investigator that we had a case in front of who has, according to the numbers that I'm told, 0 times found evidence of discrimination in any claim. Like,
yeah. Like that's not even like statistically possible. Like that's just not
right? Like
yeah.
that is just not,
Yeah.
it's not possible. And like for this guy to have his claim dismissed just means that he went through the process.
Totally. Absolutely.
So
And it's so funny. I made sure and like put that in my notes because I was like, oh, not that we want to like slam on Bully, but like this is like we see this day in, day out, right? Like this is the thing. And like the potentially like good news about this case coming out right now and being so public is that like they have determined things like that. Like they have people working for them who like never find
Well,
fault.
and then
You
part
know?
of the problem is a lot of like to give some grace to Bully, like a lot of them are not trained lawyers. They don't understand the law. They're not trained in the, and I know that this is these are part of the changes that they're trying to make over there, but like untrained, don't know the law, don't know legal evidence standards, and have like 100 cases, right?
Yeah.
So they're pretty much set up to dismiss.
Yeah.
They're
Like
not really.
who fail, they're not like given the tools that they need either. Yeah, that's why I think like hopefully this will help in that area as well for them to kind of address like some of their stuff, you know. So I feel like that was good like impetus for change. I think the other thing that was interesting about this case, and this definitely like shows my privilege in a big way, but I'm like, oh my gosh, here we are in 2020 and like Oregon is typically considered pretty liberal and pretty
but not when it comes to race.
progressive, especially in areas like Portland and Eugene. But yes, like I just was seeing like Eugene has been dealing with swastikas being painted like all over town. And then this came out and I was like, oh my gosh, like where are we? Like, what is
well, and then the interesting thing about this is that he was arrested. I mean, the nerd interesting thing about it is he was arrested in Portland. So he was booked in Portland, but all of this originated in West Lynn, which is Clackamas County, which is like traditionally not.
Well, so that's the interesting thing, actually. This took place in Portland, but the guy's buddy, who was the police chief, lived in West Lynn. So they basically came into Portland
to
and like,
surveil him.
Yes. Yeah. And like fire him from his job and arrest him, which I'm like, how is that even? And I think he even said, like, how do you fire me from my job? Like, how is that like a police
from my job?
thing? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I think like Portland, we think of as being more progressive than other places in Oregon, but there are these like very, like Portland's not just a liberal mecca. It is homogeneously white. It is like has all these
city, it's not very diverse.
Yeah, it has like all these suburbs also of like even more like Clackamas and Washington County are kind of notoriously racist in their execution of like that was one of the things it said in the article was something like I wish we could get him back to West, like the police officers were saying I wish we could get him back to West Lynn so that something like acknowledging
basically like you need to clean it up, like telling I think I know what you're talking about. The police chief was telling the towing company guy, like, you need to like clean your situation like up over there or something like that. Yeah.
Well, there was one of the police officers, I think it was some of their text messages or something. They were saying, I wish we could get him back to Westland so he could see what real racism is or something like that. There was like a comment like, I mean, and I think that this is an interesting thing because this is like overt aggressive discrimination. And I think a lot of times what happens, and part of why we don't want to engage with the news, is that we don't want to think discrimination exists, especially at this level of abuse, at this level of like, I don't know, maliciousness, like nefariousness, right? And that this person would be treated so differently just because he stood up, told his story, opposed racism, and is Black. Like that's the only reason that he's being treated differently than another employee of the towing company, right? And then, but I think that when we don't want to acknowledge that this stuff happens, it gets to this point where it is like really steeped. Like there had to be so many levels of people agreeing that discrimination is legitimate.
For
that
sure.
It's the way we want to be in order for things to get this bad. And when the rest of us are saying, oh, you know, we're done with that. Like, racism is over, then we're sort of also complicit in that, right? Like, I think that we have to be honest about where we are before we can move forward with where we want to be.
Totally. I think that's valid for sure. And it took a long time, right? Like this poor guy, like this happened like 3 years ago. And like ultimately it turned out in like a really great result. And for him, it was about like, you know, like, I don't want my sons to have to experience like the same thing. Like people should not be like going through this. Like it's worth the fight for me, but like it was like a lengthy like process.
Well, and it's interesting. I always think this when I'm reading an article like this, what we do in the news right now is we highlight the perpetrators, right? We highlight the people. We don't highlight the heroism of this man continuing to advocate for himself, continuing to call things out and not giving up, right? Which that story is in there, but we like the news wants to like it's built to trigger our evolutionary fear sense, right? Because then we get engaged and then we respond, right? And then I think one thing that we can do is always say who is the hero in this story, because each of these stories has someone who is like a true hero who's moving culture forward. And particularly this man is like somebody that we can model after and be inspired by.
Totally. Will you speak to that? Actually, do you have like advice for, this is a pretty common like scenario, I think, for folks to find themselves in a situation like this at work. If someone like sees themselves in that story, like, do you have advice for them, like practical, like first steps that they can take if they're in a similar situation?
Yeah. So the thing that I see people tend to do in these situations is think that harassment or discrimination is not real unless we feel totally defeated, discouraged, anxious, stressed out, right? And that actually can be really dangerous because then we're not identifying it until it gets to the point where it's having a physical impact on us. So the first thing that I think people need to do is be very clear, like this man was, what the behavior was that he was seeing. So for example, in his case, somebody pointed to a Confederate flag on a car and said, how do you feel about that? Or do you like that? Right? So that's a specific behavior referencing a Confederate flag. And then distinguish that behavior as different than the feelings that we have about it that are totally valid, right? So this man might have felt attacked. He might have felt, there was that Instagram story that I sent you of the woman doing the eyeshadow and talking about the racist woman.
That's so good. We should link that in the comments.
It's my favorite thing in the whole world.
It's
but basically she's like 16 bagging groceries at a grocery store, and this mentally ill woman comes up to her and says, "Don't you wish it was back to the cotton picking days?" And she says, why the fuck would you say that to me? Right? And so this the reference to the cotton picking days, the reference to slavery, right, is a behavior. And then in this story, this woman was very angry, right, which is a like totally legitimate response to have, but also separate than the problematic behavior that the other person's having. So somebody was asking me about this the other day of like, they had, someone told them a story of a woman who was attacked down an alley, and she had a knife with her, and she stabbed the person, and the person ran. And the woman who had this happen to her said, no, it's fine. Like, I lost my knife, but everything's fine. And so this person was asking me, so then do we say that attack is okay because this woman didn't have a crisis, she didn't have a heart attack, she didn't have a panic attack about it, right? No, the behavior is still unacceptable, and we need to identify the problematic behavior and then also take some time to be present with ourselves, with how we feel, that all of our feelings are valid, and that we can shift to an empowered place to call out the behaviors. So we always want to trust our instincts of what the behavior means, right? The biggest thing I see employees do who are having trouble in this situation is they say, he probably didn't mean that. Did that really happen? Did he really mean that? Like say about the Confederate flag thing. That didn't really happen. And then we start to doubt our instincts, and then we talk to a friend, and the friend says, he was probably joking. And then we devalue our own instincts about what the behavior means, and we start to feel more and more and more afraid. So what we need to do is come to a place where we trust our instincts, and we also know that even when somebody else is behaving inappropriately and totally unacceptable ways, we can be present with ourselves, we can feel how we want to feel, and we can address that behavior in the appropriate way possible. One of the reasons that this is so important is that sometimes you want to report behavior. Other times you want to address it with a person who had the behavior. Other times you want to build allies around you before you report the behavior. Like, you want to be strategic and trust your instincts about what the best next step is to like feel however you want to feel and to address the behavior that you're seeing.
Right.
That's my
That's good. No, I like it. I love it. And you have a free training, right? That people could go to if they're
so we teach the intro to that it's at erisresolution.com/power dynamics. So I go into that a little bit more into the steps of it.
So if someone is in that situation and they want to know more about like steps and how to like practically make that happen.
And in our books, Power Dynamics, erisresolution.com, Power Dynamics.
Okay, cool. Fun. Not fun, but like fun that there is something you can do instead of just being stuck and feeling overwhelmed. Yeah. Cool. Okay, so moving on, kind of similarly, Victoria's Secret has been in the news recently. The New York Times wrote a scathing, it was very well written, it was very good, but they wrote a scathing kind of like article about just the harassment and like bullying and like misogynistic like culture that has existed there for quite some time. The two guys that were kind of at the head of the company, Ed Razek and Leslie Wexner.
Who was friends with Epstein.
Yes. The New York Times said they presided over an entrenched culture of misogyny, bullying, and harassment. And there was all kinds of evidence of like sexual advances and groping and coercion to pose for nude pictures without pay, and retaliation and all kinds of other things involving many models and employees actually in this whole like thing that unfolded. And this one was interesting because when I first saw it, I kind of chuckled, and I was like, I had to check myself on my response to this one, because I was like, well, of course, like, you know, like, of course that is like what's happening there. But then I had to reel that back and be like, okay, like that's not fair, because regardless of like the situation and like what the women are wearing or doing, like nobody signs up for like harassment and abuse, especially in a workplace that's supposed to be like a professional,
Right. And I think that there's two layers to that, right? Because there's a layer of nobody is surprised about this. And then there's the layer of like the classic quid pro quo sexual harassment of, if you perform sexual favors, you can have your job. If you perform sexual favors, you can have a raise, or you can get on this like show or whatever they were promising people in exchange. And then like, I think it's such an interesting problem, because I think a lot of times what we do is we think that no one is coerced unless they're like literally being physically threatened with a gun or something. But if you're thinking about a situation where like some of these women are single moms, some of these women, like this is their dream passion to be a model, right? If you're thinking about those things that are like deeply important to you being threatened unless you perform a sexual favor, including like taking your clothes off, right? Then that's real coercion, right? Like that's real, like you have to think. And then the interesting thing, so there's this research study that says basically most people, if you ask them how they would respond to someone like propositioning them in a job interview, or saying, you look hot in that dress in a job interview, like 80% of people say they would like tell the person off, say that's inappropriate, don't ever say that to me again. So then they studied what people actually did. They actually did a research study where they put people in a scenario where this happened. 0 people did that. 0 people responded and said, that's inappropriate, don't do that. But then in this situation, you had people who did stand up to it.
Eventually, I mean, I think that's the thing that's interesting. So like, it was interesting to me. I had a super yuck response after my like initial response, because I was like, oh my gosh, I'm that person who's like, well, what was she wearing? You know what I mean? Like I like had this like, oh my gosh, I'm having that like terrible response.
Like women's clothes justify men's behavior.
Or anything
Right.
at all. Like there's just 0 justification no matter what. And I like, you know, like I totally had felt like, well, I'm like super above that. But then when I saw this headline, I was like, oh my gosh, I had that response. Like I had that like immediate, like, well, duh, of course, you know. But it's so interesting that you say that and about the study, because I think that's so true, right? Like we have this idea of like what we would do in a hypothetical circumstance. But when it comes right down to it, when you're in the actual like scenario and situation, number one, it catches you so off guard that like, you need a second to like process. And then at that point, like it can often seem like there are no like good choices. And like, especially if something is being threatened, right? Like people did eventually start like complaining and standing up to this, but not for a long time. And it had like serious ramifications. Like
they just got fired immediately when they stood up. Yeah.
Totally.
Which creates a chilling effect for everyone.
Pulled out of like, you know, the fashion show, or like these big things that were like huge in their world and their careers. And like you saw so much of like this behavior happening and everyone understanding that that's just how it was, kind of that like thing of like, well, that's just how it is. Like you just put up with it, and you know, like it's not that bad. It's
normalizing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and then I think that companies like that are enormous company, like we saw this with Uber too, when that whole thing happened, there's sort of this sense of like too big to fail about it, where it's like, if it's so entrenched in the company, the people at the top think this is nothing bad, that they can't face ramifications. And so it's interesting, we are seeing, but then you were making the point when we were talking before we got on, that even while this was happening, while it's not explicitly in the New York Times, their stores were failing.
Totally. Well, the thing that I found like really interesting about this whole story is that, there were models and employees that started coming forward and trying to deal with it and saying, no, thanks. Like, I'm not like, this is not acceptable. I'm not going to deal with this, and bearing the ramifications, like models who then were like immediately fired, or employees who like had to quit. Like they took their complaints to HR and it was kind of like laughed off, like not taken seriously at all. So it could have like perpetuated this and it never could have like come to light. But what happened instead is that kind of paved the way for some things to change. But simultaneously, and this is what I think is so interesting, is that their popularity in the public and their profits like severely declined, like significantly, like around the same time. And like the public didn't even know any of it.
Except that you can see it
but
in
there's like this
the image. Like,
well, yeah.
They say the porny image.
Yeah. And so that's what I think is so interesting, is the reason that was happening is because women were like, women like were saying no thanks to their like projected image too. You know what I mean? Like companies like Third Love that show like all kinds of different bodies and like do good and like focus on like women's health and like things like that, like we're doing better because women were like picking up on that like misogynistic like bullying like culture.
Well, and because we were offered these other options. I mean, I think for a while Victoria's Secret was other companies that were pretty similar, were the only, or it was like the other option was like very matronly. There was nothing young and fat.
or like these other options of like,
of everything.
Like, like, you can have sexy lingerie and also not feel horrible about yourself
and have eaten a meal that day, right? But then we got these other options. So I think women were automatically like, oh yeah, I do want to choose the option where I'm not feeling terrible when I walk into the store.
Totally. Yeah.
That's so interesting.
Can you speak to, so going back to like the HR complaint and the HR department, like essentially not doing anything about it. And it turns out like they ended up having to wait until like Razik, is that his name? Yes, Razik like left the company, and then they went above actual Victoria's Secret to their parent company before like any action was taken. So speaking directly to that, like, why is it in a company's best interest to like take complaints seriously and to like deal with them at the outset?
Right. Well, exactly the reason that you're saying, like, so the other research that's out there is that one incident of disrespect from a supervisor makes employees 25% less productive. So not only did they have an image that wasn't reflecting women because they weren't listening to women who were their customers, they also had this culture that was like dragging on their ability to be productive, right? If you even think about the amount of energy that had to go into, say, so a woman complains and then she's taken off of an event, out of an event, right? The amount of energy that had to have gone into that entire experience of retaliating against her is now energy that's not being used towards the goals of the company. Like every company needs to be in service to their clients, in service to their customer. And these are actions that they're taking that are like literally anti the customer, and it's showing in their ability in their sales, in their stores closing down, right?
Totally. That's good. I feel like if I was a girl who snapped, I would give you like mad snaps right now. I had that urge and I was like, that will look weird because I've never done that before, but I feel like you need to have some snaps for that.
Yeah, trying new things every day.
I mean, why not? Of all the times when you're live, like, why not?
Why not try a snap for the first time?
I love
it. The other thing that I was thinking about, there was another article that I saw that was sort of a op-ed article about this. And I read it, and I always have these op-ed articles where I'm like, that's not right. That's not true. Like, and it was like well-intended. It wasn't like 100% wrong, but it was like, misleading. So when somebody reports within a company, somebody reports to HR, the employer is obligated under the law to respond immediately and appropriately, or the other words are promptly and effectively. People have the misconception that this means that they have to conduct an investigation, and then an investigation is an immediate and appropriate response or prompt or effective response, which it's not always. Because many investigations, like what happened here, I'm sure they conducted an investigation and then they removed her from the event, right? Just because you are, and this is why you have to think about the service to the clients, that where is the energy going? Is your energy going to punish your employees and make them less productive? Or is your energy going to the service of the clients and the service of the person who's using your product, your service, right? And so like an investigation doesn't necessarily respond at all. Right.
Right. Well, I think that's what happened. So the employee, I think, went to the HR department and they, I'm sure, did an investigation, like you said, and had no, like, there was, you know, like life went on. Like it made it sound like this employee never even heard anything back.
Which often happens.
Totally. Yeah. And so then she quit because she was like, well, I can't, you know, like now I've like come forward and like had to deal with the like behavior around that, you know, that she had come forward and then didn't hear back. And so,
but I mean, I think this also speaks to when people are facing these kind of things, we have to keep making our voices heard, keep speaking out, keep telling our story. And it's not always the first person that you tell who's going to have the correct response.
Totally. Yeah. I think that like I think the actions of the folks who like initially stepped out and said, this is not okay. Like they didn't get to see like the benefit of what they did, but the ultimate like resolution and the light that's being shed now would not have been possible like without their
them.
action.
Which is another way when we're looking at these stories, I just think we have to be like, who are the heroes in this story? Like the villains are getting a ton of free advertising, but there are heroes in these stories that are just doing amazing things every day that we don't hear about.
Totally. I love that. Well, I had more questions for you, but I think like we answered them like in our roundabout discussion kind of way. So I feel like that's good. Okay. So we always like to end on like an upbeat, like happy.
Yeah, we have two like, happy.
Talking about stuff that is like not quite so hard. And although like I feel like it's so good. Like, don't you guys think that it was so good? Like to get to this point, like to know that you have tools and things that you can do even in these kinds of situations, I feel like is great. But on to our happy news. The US men's national soccer team came out in like,
finally.
I know, finally. It took them forever, but I'm like, at least they did it before like the trials actually beginning. Like they came out and it was an awesome show of like solidarity, and like what they said was not like beating around the bush or
no, it was very specific. And I think that this is, so say what they said.
Yeah. So basically for anyone who doesn't know, the women's national soccer team has brought like a gender discrimination and equal pay claim against the US Soccer Federation, I think is who it is. Something like that. But basically the guys team has been like super silent and the women's team has been like kind of fighting their fight.
And the statistics on this are like so amazing. I don't remember all the numbers, but like the women's team is paid nothing and the men's team is paid an exorbitant amount, but the women's team is the one that is good, is the one that is like making money and creating revenue for soccer and doing all these, like went to the Olympics and is like did amazing. Like they're just an amazing team.
Totally. So this is why like the suit even came about, is because they were like, this is crazy. Like we're still making nothing. And like,
and it speaks to just this preconception that men are interesting to watch in sports, but not women. Like
totally. Well, and that's what I thought was so interesting is they were like, we've been winning all the time and we're like packing the stands, like we're packing the house. Like, so that can't even be the argument anymore because statistically, like numbers wise, it's not true.
Not correct.
Like,
yeah.
Exactly. So the men's team came out and said that women were due at least triple what their last contract was in like payer.
What the men's last contract was because of the amount of success the women's team has had.
100%. And they also said, like, they came out and said that, you know, like that US soccer, that fans should support the players and not the federation, and that they accused like US soccer of a monopoly and abuse of power and like spreading a false narrative around this whole like situation, which I was like, those are fighting words. Like they're not.
Well, and it's so interesting in sports because you saw this with the gymnastics, with the Larry Nassar gymnastics stuff too, where like these people are trained up as children to be obedient to their coach, right? And so for athletes to be willing to stand up within that framework, like they get so much discouragement from standing up to the coach, standing up to the federation. Like they're taught to follow the rules. So this is like a really big deal.
I'm super excited. And I think it's so great because like, you know, on the one hand with the women, like US soccer was probably like, well, whatever, you know, I mean, like, however that's going to play out is going to play out. But when you have legitimately like all of your players on the same side and saying the same thing, you can't be like, oh, well, whatever.
You're making it up.
Then, you know, like they could strike, they could not play. Like that collective like power, like, I don't know what their contract is. I'm sure contractually they're bound in some way, shape, or form, but that collective power of like, we're all standing together like against you on this particular issue, so you have to do the right thing, is huge.
I mean, and I think like this speaks to how important it is for people with the traditionally favored characteristic, like men versus women, men versus trans people, men versus non-binary people, the people with the traditionally favored characteristic, how important it is for them to actually say something, not just to support behind the scenes, not just to say, oh, I don't want to get involved, but I agree. But like really like the specific number of they deserve at least 3 times makes an impact, right? The specificity and speaking out, which like this is another reason to stay engaged in the news, I think, is that each of us, women or men, trans, non-binary, any gender, right? Our perspective is important, even if we don't see it in the moment, right? Even if we don't see the impact in the moment, because you have to think within the men's team, there probably were a lot of men who were like, I don't want to get involved. I basically agree, but it's not my issue, right? We say it's not my issue a lot. And then it's like, it is our issue, all of us, right?
Yeah.
So,
well, and again, like, what is that quote that like is it a Martin Luther King quote, but like where like the only thing for like evil to persist is for like good people to like stand by and do nothing. That it was like a terrible slaughtering of that quote, but you know what I'm referencing? Like that's really true, right? Like you could stand by and just watch things happen if they don't involve you. But like that being said, like if you have a voice that you can use to help someone else, the idea is that you should.
Right, you should, and it does make an impact. Like I had friends who didn't vote in the last election because they said it's not going to make an impact. In states where it definitely would have. And it kind of doesn't, like our voices, each of them do make an impact until we decide ahead of time to silence ourselves.
Yeah, that's so good. Okay, that's so good. That's such a good like segue into our next thing.
Yeah.
So fun. So I feel like every week we're going to have to find more and more like new documentaries now, but we've been on a like Netflix documentary train. So last week we talked about Taylor Swift's Miss Americana, which was amazing. If you haven't seen that, you've got to watch it. This week we have to talk about Cheer. So
Jerry, Morgan,
I was just
all
gonna
of
say,
our
like,
friends.
speaking of like using your voice, like Jerry is such a good like
Oh,
example of that, right? Like that was my big takeaway of like him and his attitude and like using your voice. Like he for a while there like wasn't on the mat and was like the voice that was just like keeping
yeah,
everyone going and cheering them on and being positive, and like
yeah.
his voice had massive amounts of power and he was willing to use it even if it wasn't like directly like benefiting
On the
him in the
mat.
way that he
So
would have wanted.
for people who haven't seen it, you must watch the cheer documentary. It's about this cheerleading team who wins all of the national competitions. They're a junior college and they're just this like ragtag band of misfits who are like amazing and like show up every day and like put their bodies through torture for a, what is it, like 2 minutes and 13 seconds or
15,
something?
2 minutes and 15. This like
seconds.
traumatized me. So that's why I know like the specific number. In the very first episode, they're talking about all of this and they say, I mean, these guys are like training like all day, every day. And some of them have worked their whole lives for this like the, grand national like championships or whatever. It's like a 2-minute and 15-second routine. Like everything is riding on that. I just was like, I
They're
can't
like breaking
even, almost
bones
can't even breathe.
and yeah, it's amazing. But they're like showing up, and then there's this guy Jerry who is not, and being on the mat, like being in the ultimate presentation
The
is
team that's
yeah,
competing like
yeah,
at
the
the
competing team is the
championship.
goal. And so Jerry's like not on the team, but he is like steps in for anything. And it ends up his ability to do that, I think, is like the crucial thing to let them win,
I
right?
agree. I think so because he like maintained that
Spoiler
good
alert, they
attitude.
win.
Huh?
I said spoiler alert, they win.
I know. Yes, I was so sorry. So sorry. Shoot. But no, I agree. Like, I mean, I think like, and just his ability, like going back to him using his voice, like, I think he had a lot of important conversations with people on the team that allowed him to step in the way that he did, like towards the end, that like had someone not like been able to do that, it could have like, they wouldn't have been as cohesive as a team. Like they wouldn't have been able to come together in the way that they did. He actually, I just saw a clip on Instagram, but they were at Oprah's like Super Soul Sunday or something like that. And she was like, I think we need like a mat talk, Jerry. And he like did his like screaming, jumping up and down for like Oprah's audience. It was the best thing ever. It was so good.
So good.
But yeah, I found that show so fascinating. Like it was so amazing in so many different ways. Jerry was definitely, I love Jerry, but like all of their stories were just like so precious and powerful. And like Monica, the coach, like her story is so interesting. Like I would love to know more about like her.
Well, and it's an interesting situation, right? Even from like a discrimination and a gender perspective, because like it's a team run by a woman and it's a traditionally female area, like sport, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have these men who really are showing up and really like feel belonging in this traditionally female.
Well, it was so interesting. Like there was multiple things that were interesting about that and about her for me. But like, if you looked at like most of the people who were like the heads of like the different cheer organizations or even the other coaches were men. Like she seemed pretty specifically like female in that role. And it was funny because like even watching her, again, there were times where I had this internal monologue of like, oh, she's kind of being a bitch. And then I was like, that's not fair. Like she's being a coach. Like she is being an award-winning, like
being a leader.
Like I'm having this reaction because that's what we do with women. You know what I mean? And so that was fascinating. I also am like, I can't imagine the amount of shit that like she has had to put up with because they're in like teeny tiny Corsicana, Texas, and she is like, I have faith, I have religious beliefs, but these guys who are coming into their program, lots of them are LGBTQ. And like, she is so accepting and affirming of them. And she was like, I will go down, like fighting you about this, like kind of counter.
She just loves them.
Loves them. They're amazing. Yes.
Yeah.
And she like, thinks of them all like her kids and like takes it super personally, like, like if they don't win or something like that. But also it's like fascinating to me because she has kids of her own. And so I'm like, she's working all these hours at this job and like is in this position where she like needs to win, but also like people in her town like don't even necessarily like know who she is, so I was like, there's so many narratives going on. Like she's a working mom who's like killing it, but like she's not getting like necessarily like recognition,
the local validation.
Totally. But like people who see her from the outside are like, oh, having a reaction to her leadership and things like that. So the whole thing was like very fascinating.
But I think you see like even her being this woman in a crowd of other male leaders in a predominantly female field, which is very typical, right? Like even in predominantly female fields, the men somehow
are the leaders. Yeah.
And quite often, but I think the thing that she does is she does not give up, and she teaches her kids to not give up.
Which is why it's so powerful, I think. Like she basically is like, I mean, I think one of the things she said that was so amazing was like, these kids like don't necessarily come from this background. Like a lot of them have really traumatic past, like really hard stories, but she's like, they want like expectation, like they want people to expect things of them and to have that structure and to like be hard on them. They don't know it, but like, that's what they're responding to. And it really does like create this, like, like there are times when she's intense, but it creates this, like most of them are like, I would do anything. Like I would die for her. Like if
it creates safety for them though, when they know what the expectations are and that they're not allowed to give up. Yeah. And I think that that's what we need to do, kind of to wrap it up, because I know you got to run, but like, I think that's what we need to do with all of these things. Instead of using these stories to silence ourselves, not give up and like keep trying something new and keep moving forward and expect the people around us to continue to move forward too.
So good. I love that. So good.
Oh, so we also wanted to say, if people have questions or any particular news stuff they want us to cover, just post it in the comments or send us a message.
For sure. We'd love to talk about what you want us to talk about or answer questions of what you want to know about. So
cover everything. All right.
All right. It was fun.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.